Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Franca Palazzo. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Internet Society, and I'd like to welcome you to AI Infrastructure and Governance Policy in Canada. Before we begin, I want to give a huge thank you to our presenting sponsor, Evertz Microsystems, a Canadian technology company headquartered in Burlington, and Deloitte Canada as our supporting sponsor. Without the support of organizations like yourselves, we couldn't have events like today. At the Canadian Internet Society, we advocate for an internet that is open, safe, and affordable. That includes, and ready to support a long-term digital future for Canada. That includes advocating for AI systems that are transparent, trusted, and scalable. Over the past several months, we have hosted national roundtables, we've launched a digital sovereignty working group, and begun developing a framework to assess digital legislation and infrastructure with sovereignty and accountability at its core. Today's sessions are a key part of that work. They will help inform our formal submission to the federal AI consultation, and they will strengthen the foundation we're building for a practical digital sovereignty framework that reflects Canadian values and priorities. Now we're going to jump right into the program. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarkis Abrahamian, Director of Business Development for Government and Defense at Evertz Microsystems. Sarkis has worked closely with governments around the world to deliver secure, scalable infrastructure that supports sovereignty and resilience. He's been with Evertz since 2002 and helped design some of the core optical and IP technologies that power mission-critical networks today. Sarkis, I'd like to invite you up.
Thank you, Franca, and good afternoon, everybody. It's truly an honor to be here at the Rideau Club and to help open today's event, which is AI Infrastructure and Governance Policy in Canada, from Principles to Practice. And thank you to the Canadian Internet Society for bringing together such a thoughtful mix of people, government, industry, and in academia. These cross-sectors conversations are exactly what we need if we're serious about strengthening Canada's digital future. I first joined Evertz in 2002 and spent almost a decade there before returning last year. Coming back after that time away, I found a company that had matured, and refined this technology to truly world-class levels, a Canadian success story built on innovation, precision, and purpose. Originally, Evertz built this reputation on broadcast technology. Today, it's a Canadian leader in real-time media communications and infrastructure, supporting not just broadcast and entertainment, but also government and defense organizations here at home and also around the world. What hasn't changed are the principles that define who we are. We innovate relentlessly, creating technologies that move video, data, and intelligence faster and more securely than ever before. We operate with integrity, delivering trusted in the most demanding mission-critical environments. And we defend our independence, answering the call for sovereign Canadian technology that is designed, built, and controlled here at home. The same commitment drives our work today on Canadian sovereign cloud initiatives. Together with partners like Renovis and ThinkOn, we're building a data infrastructure platform that keeps the security and sovereignty entirely within Canada, ensuring control, resilience, and trust at every layer. It's great to see Craig McClellan here, someone who's been such a strong champion of that vision. And of course, the recent AWS outage was a timely reminder of why this conversation matters. Sovereign infrastructure isn't just about where data resides. It's about ensuring the systems Canadians rely on every day remain secure, resilient, and with Canada in mind first. That's what today's event is all about, moving from principles to practice, from talking about responsible AI and secure infrastructure to actually building the framework, the governance, and the technology that will make it real. So on behalf of Evertz and everyone at Evertz, I want to say how proud we are to be part of this conversation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Alexandra Dostal, Assistant Deputy Minister at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. Alexandra's leadership in ISED is central to how Canada approaches innovation and digital policy, and we truly appreciate her being here today to share the government's perspective on this involving and important file. Please join me in welcoming Alexandra Dostal.
Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Alexandra Dostal, and I'm here from Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, or also known as ISED. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Alexandra Dostal et je suis très heureuse d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. It is a real pleasure for me to join you here at the Rideau Club, and I do want to thank the Canadian Internet Society for bringing this group together and hosting this really important and timely discussion on AI infrastructure and governance. Today's topic, AI infrastructure and governance, I think really goes to the core of what kind of digital economy we want to build in Canada. Number one, it's about sovereignty, ensuring that Canadians, Canadian institutions, and Canadian companies have control over the data, the models, compute resources that power artificial intelligence and our digital economy. It's also about security, protecting that infrastructure from emerging risks, whether cyber, geopolitical, or economic. It's about service delivery, ensuring that governments can safely deploy AI to improve how we serve Canadians efficiently, transparently, and responsibly. And importantly, it's also about innovation and competitiveness, positioning Canada to seize the economic and productivity benefits of AI while ensuring that those benefits are broadly shared and aligned with our values. So when we talk about AI infrastructure, we're not really just talking about technology. We're talking about national capacity, economic security, and public trust. And the government certainly will be thinking about these and these important intersections as it charts a path forward. So the good news is Canada's certainly not starting from scratch, as you all know. Canada has built an extraordinary foundation over the past decade. So from the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, which helped establish world-class research hubs through Canada's 3 national AI institutes, so Mila, Amy, and Vector, to the sovereign compute strategy more recently announced, which is backed by a $2 billion investment to ensure that Canadian researchers and businesses have access to secure, high-performance compute infrastructure here at home. These efforts, I think, have really positioned Canada as a leader and an early mover on responsible AI. So our scientists have certainly helped create the field, and our policies have emphasized safety, inclusivity, and innovation from the outset. As AI becomes more central to productivity, to security, and national resilience, we now face the challenge of scaling that foundation, turning the world-class research capacity into world-class deployment capacity. Globally, we're witnessing a rapid concentration of AI capability and a handful of very, very large models built on large data sets, run on infrastructure owned by a small number of companies and jurisdictions. That concentration raises questions for countries like Canada. Who owns the models we rely on? Where is our data stored and processed? What legal regimes govern that data? Ours, someone else's? And how do we ensure that Canadian values and priorities are reflected in the AI systems that increasingly shape our economy and society? These aren't abstract questions. They really touch everything from law enforcement and health data to financial systems and how our public services operate. So for Canada, ensuring that we retain control over our critical digital assets is essential to maintaining both privacy and sovereignty. That's why initiatives like the Sovereign Compute Strategy I mentioned are so important, not only to support research and innovation, but to guarantee that we can train and deploy AI systems under Canadian control within our frameworks. But infrastructure alone isn't enough. Governance, the policies, the standards, and the rules that guide how AI is built and used is equally essential. If Canadians don't trust AI systems, they won't use them. And if governments and institutions can't assure Canadians that their data, their rights, and their security are protected, then adoption will stall. So that's why Canada has made responsible AI governance a core part of our approach. So just to give a few examples, we showed international leadership by co-founding the Global Partnership on AI with France in 2020 and advancing work at the OECD on AI governance. We've acted domestically as well with initiatives like the Voluntary Code of Conduct for Generative AI, which has now been adopted by 46 Canadian and global firms. And we've built capacity to stay at the cutting edge of AI safety issues with the establishment of the Canadian AI Safety Institute, which brings together researchers and policymakers to deepen the science of AI safety. These efforts share one goal: building the confidence that AI in Canada is being developed and deployed safely, transparently, and responsibly. Because trust is not a barrier to innovation, but a prerequisite for it. The Government of Canada is also undertaking concrete steps to strengthen its own responsible use of AI. So earlier this year, as you may be aware, the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat released the AI strategy for the Federal Public Service, which is a roadmap to guide how federal institutions design, develop, and use AI across government. The strategy's vision is clear. By responsibly adopting AI, the government can deliver world-class services, accelerate science and research, protect Canada's interests, and create a more innovative and efficient workplace. The strategy applies across the AI lifecycle from design to decommissioning and covers all adaptive AI technologies developed or procured by the Government of Canada, setting a global standard for openness, accountability, and trust in public sector AI. And now, as you'll be talking about today, the government is looking to build on all of this with a new Canadian National AI Strategy. Minister Evan Solomon, Canada's first Minister of AI and Digital Innovation, recently announced a 30-day national sprint to inform this work, which will culminate in the release of a renewed strategy later this year. The strategy will be informed by thinking through input gathered from the AI Strategy Task Force, which is a group of Canadian experts to provide actionable insights and key recommendations. We're also seeking input from other stakeholders, including through a public consultation running until the end of the month. So I certainly encourage you all to participate in the consultation. The plan for this strategy is to build on the progress that we've made through the Pan-Canadian AI Strategy and the Sovereign Compute Strategy, taking a whole-of-economy approach. The consultations on this strategy are structured around 8 pillars, many of which will be very relevant to the discussion that you'll be having here today. First, building enabling infrastructure, which is about ensuring that Canada has the sovereign digital backbone needed to train and deploy AI systems that reflect Canadian laws and values. Second, building safe AI systems and strengthening public trust in AI. Because to support our other goals, it's important to ensure that the products we're creating and the businesses that we're supporting are worthy of trust. This is about ensuring that Canadians feel confident that the AI technologies that they use are developed and deployed safely and responsibly, and that globally, Canada maintains its reputation as a leader in trustworthy AI. Third, the security of Canadian infrastructure, which is about strengthening our digital and compute infrastructure against emerging risks from cyber threats to misuse by malicious actors. In addition to these three themes, we want to hear from Canadians on a range of additional topics: research and talent, AI adoption, commercialization of AI, scaling AI, Canadian AI champions, and education and skills. It's a critical time now to shape the future direction of Canada's digital economy, and we really do look forward to all of your ideas in all of these areas. So just in closing, I'll say this. Canada's leadership in AI has always come from combining scientific excellence with a clear sense of public purpose. As we enter this next chapter, that balance remains our greatest strength. Alors que vous entrons dans ce nouveau chapitre, cet équilibre nous reste vraiment notre grande force. So by working together across government, industry, civil society, we can ensure that Canada's AI future is innovative, competitive, and above all, sovereign and trusted. So I'm really grateful that the Canadian Internet Society has organized this discussion today, and we're really looking forward to your submission. So thank you again for inviting me to join you today. Merci encore.
everybody, thanks for joining us here today. I'm very excited to be part of this event and being joined by the three esteemed, wonderful panelists. And how I will kick things off, and it's an honor actually to kick things off with the first panel here, is to give you a quick overview on what we have agreed or hope to cover here today, which is quite a wide range of topics. First of all, we like to take a closer look at what sovereign control means. Defining sovereign, one has to be sometimes a little bit careful, but we will take a closer look at it in terms of control over data, metadata, or also derived models. And then we will take a closer look at how do you balance now innovation and regulation, because I personally, I wrote an op-ed some time ago because it's a topic I always felt very strongly about. How do you innovate and regulate, and then while looking also at other jurisdictions, can we learn from them? How have they done it? So innovation doesn't get stifled by regulation, but there have to be guardrails in place. So this is going to be, I think, also a very interesting discussion. We then move also, I mentioned international comparisons before we move into a topic of maybe looking at the EU or the US. What have they done? What have they done well? Maybe not so well. A lot of discussions I recall over the past years in terms of the EU AI Act and just some challenges as well, which the EU had many discussions with some EU representatives have recognized and realized themselves. And then very importantly, we will have a closer look as well at equity and bias. I mean, that's really a conversation in terms of if you think about equity, inclusion, and diversity, algorithmic bias, but also bias within when you develop products, when you deploy products, and when you look at the end user. And there's some great research that was done here as representatives on the panel. So I let each panelist introduce themselves and maybe tell us just briefly why you find the topic we're discussing today of great importance, why you're here and what you wish to contribute, and actually help Franca and her wonderful organization to feed into the consultation that was mentioned earlier. So Emily, may I start with you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Laidlaw. I am a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law at the University of Calgary. I am a law professor there, and I'm also a board member of the Canadian Internet Society. So I'm thrilled to be here because I think, well, for a variety of reasons, the questions about digital sovereignty for Canadians and how to address the opportunities and challenges presented by AI are coming at a key moment in time for Canada. And I come at it from the legal perspective, so the question for me is, how do you actually create a legal and governance environment that supports the kind of innovation that you want, but at the same time ensures accountable AI, ensures that we're building out trustworthy AI. And that forces us to look in many directions. It forces us to look in the direction of who geopolitically we want to be partnering with. What are the values that we want to align with these different jurisdictions? And how do you build that out into concrete rules? I mean, one of the things that businesses benefit from is certainty. And providing certainty of rules so they know the name of the game and the environment that they're in is key to that kind of success. I think we're going to continue talking about digital sovereignty, but maybe I will just pause there before digging deep into other aspects as we continue.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Wendy.
My name's Wendy Sukier, and I'm a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management, Toronto Metropolitan University. I shifted to entrepreneurship and strategy after many years as an IT professor because during my stint as the Vice President of Research and Innovation, I stepped out of the industry for 5 years. And when I looked at stepping back in, I realized my students knew way, 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 way more than I was ever going to know. And entrepreneurship innovation doesn't change that much. So this is where I ended up. But I started my career working at the Ministry of Transportation and Communications when it was the Ministry of Transportation and Communications. And so while most of my career has been spent looking at technology adoption, entrepreneurship, and so on, I remember very clearly the debates when I started my job about long-distance competition. Anybody here old enough to remember that? Anyone here old enough to remember the interconnection debates? Like, you used to have to get the phone from Bell Canada, and you had to pay more if you wanted a pink phone, but you couldn't plug in a phone that you bought anywhere else, right? And so I started my career in the industry when there was really, really, really tight regulation, and I lived through the issuing of the wireless. I was working as a consultant when the wireless competition was decided, and so on and so forth. So I have kind of a mixed view in the sense that I have seen what happens when you deregulate and how that can really drive innovation, entrepreneurship, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. But I've also seen the challenges when you deregulate across sectors. You know, it used to be that public convenience and necessity shaped everything from bus service to telecommunications. And there was a huge focus on equity and access, even back before most of you were born. And so I'm really interested in the conversation because I work with a lot of small, medium enterprises. My team's about 80 full-time staff, and we lead research for the Future Skills Center, for the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, a number of other big projects. And one of the things that really concerns me is what I label the AI paradox. So Canada leads in technology development, and you know, Geoffrey Hinton was a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize. But by almost any standard, we lag in the adoption of technology. Now, why is that? Well, part of it is, and people forget this, and certainly a lot of the policymakers overlook this, we are a country of small, medium enterprises, right? 90% of employment in this country is with SMEs. Only 50% is in the United States. And small, medium enterprises do not have the capacity, the know-how, the skills, or the time, especially in this environment, to think about doing things because they're struggling to survive. So I'm really interested in this discussion because I think the regulatory frameworks that we establish are going to be key in terms of protecting Canadians and at the same time driving innovation, but also serving the public interest. And I think that's the third leg of the stool that often gets overlooked in these debates, where it's seen as a tension between sort of individual ownership of our data versus corporate profits. And I think we have to think about the public interest and Canada's interest at this particular moment in time.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And last but not least, Nas, please.
Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. This is great to be part of such a great panel. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Elnaz Kanani, and I'm a partner with Artificial Intelligence Practice with Deloitte Canada. And also I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, Telfair School of Management. The work that I do is slightly different in a sense that I work exclusively with the Government of Canada, and the idea is how can we bring this theory into practice? The topic of AI, having this in practice, making sure that people can actually use this technology in a safe and secure way, that is the problem I'm dealing with on a daily basis. The reason I'm specifically interested in this topic is that I'm personally very passionate about the topic of AI. My background is mathematics. I used to be the data scientist who would sit and code and enjoy that. And now I'm trying to make this like a larger program, a big solution that can make a change for this country. And I can see the capability because like I said, I've been the one coding these solutions. I've been the one sitting somewhere and building an algorithm and working on that. So I can see what a value this technology can bring to the table and what an impact it can make. And then I hear all of these concerns, and suddenly all of this great technology and concepts and algorithms that are changing on a daily basis suddenly becomes a threat. And that is the moment that I feel like, what can we do to make people understand that, yes, I'm not saying that this threat is not real. We are dealing with a very complex environment right now, but at the same time, being smart, we can consider that threat, keep that in mind, and then also make an improvement in the way that we work with the technology, with the right tool, in the right environment, and all that. So I am a big believer that knowing the problem is the main step to solving the problem, and that's why I'm specifically passionate about this topic.
Great. I mean, first of all, what a variety of perspectives and backgrounds. This is the benefit of having such a diverse panel. I mean, really compliments Franca for putting it together. It's just really fascinating. Well, then let's dive into our first question. Whether Wendy or Emily want to start there maybe first. It's about sovereignty that I think, Emily, you also said, yes, it's definitely a topic we will be discussing a little more. And sovereign control, and what does that exactly mean if I try to define it in terms of sovereign control over data, metadata, and so forth? And what does it mean for the Canadian public and private institutions, maybe legally and also operationally? I mean, there's a lot in that question. You please, whatever you feel comfortable with or whatever your thoughts are on this. Who would like to kick it off, whether Wendy or Emily? Okay, Wendy. Sorry, Emily. Yes, you just, okay, you go ahead, please.
I mean, it is the question, isn't it? You know, we've tossed out this term as though we know what it means. But at its core, sovereignty is really about the agency of Canada. And I mean this all in terms of both the public and the private sector, individuals and government, having the agency to make decisions about its own digital future. And so I think, you know, everyone in this room probably has ideas and maybe what the core components are that form that agency. And I don't have all the answers to that. So I'll tell you the top ones that come of mind to me is one is facilitating the innovation culture, which I think that we all know, and that's why we're seeing the investments we're seeing in kind of Canadian homegrown and made businesses, but also ensuring that we're training the talent at a university level, that there are opportunities when they come out, that there is an environment that they want to stay in. And Wendy, I might just kick that more to you when it gets to you, because I imagine this is much more in your wheelhouse than mine. The other aspect to this is building a governance and regulatory framework that is coherent. I will say that at this moment, Canada does not offer that. And there have been numerous attempts at digital policy. And we saw that with, if we could create a Venn diagram, it would solve all things right now, because what we see is some key overlapping areas of law that are all important here. One is sort of the domain of private sector privacy and cybersecurity and what needs to apply there. The other would be this sort of AI regulation, whether Canada passes that or not. And then you have competition law and the possibility of online harms, because we can't forget that we're seeing a huge uptick now of AI facilitated harms, whether we're looking at, you know, the examples I've been giving lately are about, you know, the chat GPT, pushing suicide content to children, prompting psychotic breaks, character.ai becoming immersive and kind of developing sexual relationship with a child who then took his life. So AI facilitated harms here are enormous and it's opaque. But if we don't have all of those laws in Canada, but they all overlap. And so there needs to be much stronger conversation about what regulatory coherence looks like domestically, so that we have meaningful regulation that isn't just performative on the part of companies and weighs them down with box ticking and things to do, especially in an environment of SMEs. But also we have to look across the pond. If we're wanting to align ourselves with the EU, there are values there that have been established through their Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and so on, that Canada needs to look at how we don't have to necessarily align, but how we can build a coherent framework that would fit with the EU. And I acknowledge that we are in an interesting times given our relationship with the United States as well, but policy choices need to be made about how to create that coherent framework. And I'll end with maybe one final point, and that is, one of the ways that I think that coherence can also be built out is that there's tremendous expertise in this area across Canada, and we need to be bringing them into the room to advise the government. I mean, if I had to wave a magic wand, I would suggest that they create some sort of expert kind of policy advisory body on digital issues that were across the ecosystem of these different areas, because they are connected. And without that kind of feedback and iterative feedback, then there isn't going to be the awareness of between these different silos.
Yeah, thank you so much. Especially, you just reminded me of all the bills out there, or that used to be out there. If you think about the previous, well, C27, that's right. But you have also C26, now C8. Then you have Bill C2, look at parts 14 and 15, the Online Harms Act, which was C63. You're absolutely, there is that coherent element that you mentioned, and there are probably many more that we have the pleasure of probably engaging with in the near future. I leave it whether Wendy or Elnas, is there anything you wish to add to this topic?
I'm so conflicted about this, because on the one hand I'm just fascinated, and on the other hand I'm absolutely terrified. And to me, you know, I don't know who said it, but recently someone said Canada needs to be a lot more concerned about sovereignty, because the world has changed and we now live with a neighbor who's both capricious and dangerous. And I remember when the Patriot Act came in, a lot of my colleagues were very concerned about the fact that university was going Google. And I was like a conspiracy theorist, whatever. Anybody here scrub their phones before they go south of the border now? You know, it's a clear and present danger from my perspective, not having appropriate protection and sovereignty of our data, our infrastructure, and so on. At the same time, I'm old enough to remember, you know, I was leading something called the Northeastern Ontario Telehealth Network many years ago, and it was just when Macs were coming in, and we were using Macs in the office. But the government of Ontario, in its wisdom, decided that we needed a Canadian-built personal computer. Anybody remember the icon? Right? And so we put a bunch of money into developing a Canadian-made computer and forced all of the participants in this provincially funded network to put in icon computers. And guess what? We didn't get very far. So I think we have to recognize that as much as there is incredible Canadian talent and opportunity and amazing Canadian businesses and so on, we can't cut ourselves off from global innovators as well. And what I worry about is that we let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. And what I keep hearing from businesses, we did a big survey of SMEs, 1,700 of them. A lot of them are stuck because there is no certainty. And the rule of law creates certainty in which organizations can make decisions about investments and innovation and so on. So all I would say, if I knew the minister, is get on with it. You know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. And frankly, while I think there are certain things we want to harmonize with the EU over. I think they've gone too far on some of their regulatory frameworks, and I think we need a Canadian compromise, which we always have, between some of the models in the US and some of the models in the EU.
Yeah, thank you. And the term also harmonization or alignment is often a bit tricky. Often we prefer really to look at interoperability and absolutely.
That's why I prefer coherence, actually. It's a little softer, a little less.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, cohere, yes. Yeah, I was just thinking about, there's another great example, great Canadian company. Elnas, is there anything you wish to add to this?
Just one tiny comment here. As I'm listening to this conversation, and many other conferences these days, talks that we all listen to, podcasts, and unfortunately, we have lots of sources for information these days. There is one tiny problem here, and I mean, one of the problems, let's put it this way, is that I don't think that we are all talking about the same things when we use these words, whether like sovereign, bias, security, residency. I feel like there is like absolutely echoing what Emily and also Wendy mentioned, 100% agreed. We need to act on it. We need to have the right policies in place. But before that, we need to understand what is the problem. I honestly don't think that we are all on the same page in terms of what it means when we're talking about the problems of our data leaving the Canadian border. Like, why is that a problem? Like, have you ever thought about that? Like, why that can be a problem? I mean, what can they do with our data? The data that is probably being hosted by some governmental agency. If you think about it, then when you explore the definition of this problem, then you can see what could be the solution for a problem like this, and whether or not it should be top of the list to address, or maybe the second item on the list.
And you're pointing out a great, very important challenge. I think it's often when we look at certain terminologies that the definition is not quite clear, or it's being interpreted or understood in a different context, even per culture, per jurisdiction, and so forth. Yeah, please, Wendy.
I can be super clear. I don't think foreign governments should have access to Canadians' data, particularly sensitive data, without a court-approved, what do you call it, search warrant, whatever the thing is, from a Canadian source. Like, for me, that is pretty fundamental if you're concerned about keeping Canadians safe. That doesn't mean that we can't collaborate with foreign countries. And there are some models of, creating servers in other countries and so on. But if a foreign government has access, I don't mind my government having access to my information. I love CRA, right? Because that's where the public interest comes into play. I think as Canadians, we say our government can have access to certain information. Our government can make policies and decisions based on having access to our information, and most Canadians accept that. But I get very twitchy when I think about the prospect of foreign governments having access to Canadians' personal information. I don't know if others agree.
So just to add something to what Wendy mentioned, I use that as an example, and intentionally I used a very sensitive example. So I'm not saying that it's not a problem. I was just saying, like, my comment was more on, like, let's think about what are the problems of all of these risks that we're thinking about. Like, just wanted to clarify that that's not what I was referring to.
Yeah, so, and I might jump in here to say 100% agree, we need to talk about definitions. I don't think we're going to land on them. I think that maybe we can identify it. We'll get into this horribly academic exercise of a taxonomy, and maybe it's necessary, but we could at least find shared understanding. But something like, you gave that example of that sensitive issue of data crossing borders, and my initial reaction was, of course, this is an enormous issue. but also this has been heavily studied. We don't have very good solutions to this, but I mean, I look back to the very beginning of internet regulation and internet governance issues, and what was the big question? It was the ability of courts to be able to enforce their judgments against actors that were in other jurisdictions. And we continue to have enormous challenges when it comes to this space. It's why we talk about regulators needing to have stronger powers as the privacy commissioner, why we need to have maybe an online harms regulator that would have the power to fine, and even then, is it going to be just a cost of doing business, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these conversations are the fact that, you know, we're talking about an inability of our country to apply and enforce its own laws within kind of our own borders. And that is deeply concerning. And this is only now amplified when it comes to AI. I am going to talk out of two sides of my mouth here when it comes to AI, because I know, you know, that thing, we need to think deeply about this. We don't know what makes mistakes. My first criticism of the AI Act, which we'll get to, although we're messing with the order of things right now, aren't we, is you know, my first criticism of it was, like many, it came out of nowhere. There wasn't really much consultation. I had some conversations later about it, but it wasn't the kind of extensive conversation that AI regulation has or should have in these circumstances. Now I'm going to talk out of the other side of my mouth is, dear God, do we need this yesterday? As a basic level, we need to have some accountability framework that isn't relying on companies that right now, they are in an arms race to consolidate power. And what we're seeing is that all the decades that it took for some of these platforms to gain power has just been accelerated overnight over the last couple of years, because they already had power and used that power, because they're data driven, to then gather power as AI companies. That is concerning for Canada, because we don't have then that oversight over it, and we want to fuel the innovation economy, also want to protect the rule of law within Canada, and we do face a significant threat without setting the rules of trustworthy AI.
Well, yes, can't agree more with you. And just like one example on like something related, a few days ago I was chatting with someone, a technologist, just to be clear, and I had like a 30-second complete like blank when I heard this. We were talking about the same topic, and one of the things that was mentioned was that we were talking about the fact that whether or not for this specific use case, we can use a data center that is not located in Canada, and it's actually Eastern US. So not in Canada, but in North America. And of course, the answer is that no, like we can't. Data should stay in Canada. Sure, of course, that's how it is. And then the next sentence, or like the next few parts of the conversation, was about the fact that, and that's when I completely was kind of like, is this really happening? Was that if we mask data, if we mask the data so that it's not like an individual is not recognizable, then it's okay, it can stay anywhere. So at macro level, we are good. This is scary. That's when I say, like, sometimes I feel like we need to think about what it means that when we're talking about this is a risk, why is this a risk? Because then there is a comment, again, just to be clear, this is not correct. Regardless, personal data should not leave Canadian border. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to explain is that it is important to understand why this is a risk, not just because I like my government, I don't trust any other governments, but really, like, deeply, what does it mean? So that we can't, like, that statement is like a red or, I don't know, black flag or something like that, of like, how can we say that at macro level we can let data leave the Canadian border and that's fine? No, that's not fine. But it is because it was never well understood for this person who's actually a technologist, that what does it mean for data to leave Canadian border? So that's really what I was referring to. Is kind of like in my head, I was like, no, that's a problem. That is actually a serious problem.
Thank you so much. And I think what's important with that deeper analysis, it will help also with public trust, because the public then also gains a better understanding of, to your point, what is the problem and why, what's the rationale, what is the suggested solution, and something that is explained in simple terms and plain text to everybody. And that, because we talked about also as one of the topics here, public trust and trust per se in the technology. We touched upon, and this is great, this is organic, I like it much more than having all the questions outlined, but we promised earlier to touch a little bit upon innovation and regulation, that balance as well. Perhaps if we just take one closer look at it one more time, and maybe Elnas, I stay with you, and how can AI teams balance innovation and agility in model development while respecting privacy, sovereignty, and also compliance requirements? And I mean, there a little bit of a thought of the Cloud Act comes as well into play, because if you have using cloud or hybrid infrastructures and influenced by laws like, for example, the Cloud Act, if you wouldn't mind commenting.
Of course, yeah. This is a question for every single organization I'm working with, because we understand that data, we have a rich data set, technology is advanced. Actually, sometimes it's not very expensive. So, and we have lots of resources doing some of the repetitive tasks. So can we make it better? That's a typical question. And then always in these scenarios, there is this other person at the table who's kind of like, wait, what do you mean? Like AI, I don't trust data. I don't trust AI. I don't trust this technology and all that, which is a very valid point. So the way we approach this, and I think that this has been very effective across large organizations, and I think that it would work like in smaller, medium-sized organizations as well, is that and I say this like with an air quote, and I truly mean that, to have a proper framework in place. A framework to me is not a nice, good-looking deck that has all the right colors and all the right icons and it's pleasant to read, and still at the end of it be like, okay, what am I doing with it? And people are still struggling to follow like the tactical steps of it. What we have been doing is that we have been recommending and we've been helping different organizations to think of tactical things that they need to do when it comes to innovation and using AI. What do I mean by that? Still, I'm not helping. I understand that. So let's think about the case of we need to make sure that this data, like this specific data set, I need to understand that I'm using this for this specific algorithm. This data is classified as whatever level it is, and I need to be careful about it. Just that statement. Think about that. So frameworks like this break down a state or a problem statement like this into steps of, like, for example, classify your data, identify whether and by classify, like in my world it is like protected B, PII, this and that, like the different levels that we have, but for any organization it can apply. So classify your data, understand what is it that you're going to do with your data. For example, is the data collected for example, reporting on something macro? In that case, you cannot use it for something totally different. You need to go and ask for consent. So like step-by-step guideline of, as you're thinking about a use case, what are the steps that you need to follow to make sure that you are on the right path? Here, something else is also happening without us noticing. In the world of data scientists, we love data sets. The more complex, the uglier it is, happier we'll be. I'm not kidding. It's just like a challenge for us. However, the worst thing that can happen to us is that we start working with a data set, we create something, and then someone comes to us and say, oh, you were not allowed to do that. Like, why did you generate this graph? Like, how? Like, where is it sitting? And all those sorts of things. However, it would be awesome if from day one, that was in practice happening in parallel with us. So day one, as I start looking at a use case and asking for data sets that would support that use case, I should have a framework here that says, go look at the classification of the data. That's your first step. Your second step is that what was the purpose of collecting this data? Why was it collected first place? And now, what are you using it for? Are these two, are they the same or not? If not, you need to, you cannot just, here, you need to stop. You need to do something here. So something that as the model development, as the testing, as all these steps we are going through, we can validate each and every single step so that it's not a block afterthought. It's more of like a parallel, in parallel activity that we need to keep in mind as we are doing innovation. Someone would argue, last piece here is that, okay, still you're making it difficult for me. And that is correct. You're right. Especially if you think about the younger generation coming out of school excited, they want to put all of this into practice, and then you're going to tell them, oh, no, hold on a second. Why was the data collected? What are you going to do with it? There is this moment that you kind of see that all that motivation is gone for a second. But what we've been seeing right now in actually two of the organizations I'm working with right now is that we are giving different environments for different purposes. You have, for example, a sandbox for innovation. Go explore. And here are the data sets, all the connectors that are good to use. So I'm limiting access to what is allowed to be used for exploration. So you have access to this environment, all of these AI services, and all of these data sets. Go explore, go innovate. But the moment that you want to replicate that in a production-grade environment, we need to follow that framework. So it's something that can happen in parallel. It's not a blockage. It's just that we need to keep in mind that it's not an afterthought. It is a in parallel process.
Can I ask a question? So I have a question for you on just a practical level, achieving that, because I love that. That was fascinating. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh, this very much fits with the kind of privacy by design frameworks that we're talking about. And in the online harm space, we also talked about it too, that we need to just think about it as the front end. Something that kind of in my world, some of the struggle has been one, what I'll ask you is, who should be in the room together to ensure that it's actually done up front? But second, how do you ensure it's done in a meaningful way and not, because some aspects of privacy impact assessments and so on end up being a box-ticking exercise that a corporation needs to just get through to get on with the work that they want to do. And it is incentivizing the sense of responsibility that comes along with creation and innovation. That is such a tricky piece in all of this. So I'm hoping you can solve all these problems, and then she can just run all of this for us, right?
No, it's a great question, Emily. I appreciate you raising that. I have another scary story. So the other day, I was with one of my amazing clients, going through I want to say deployment, but it's actually pre-deployment. But let's say that we have built a solution and we tested everything is good. We want to deploy it in production. Everything is good, right? And then we need to go through a process. Exactly to your scenario, exactly that. We need to go through a process. They have I'm not going to use the acronyms because I honestly don't know to what degree it's going to identify the organization, so I'm going to keep it very high level. So let's think of it as a PM-based process, like a management. We just want to know who's going to access it, what's the version control, all those sorts of things. Here is the process that we have in our organization. Step by step, you should follow this, and then you can deploy. As simple as that. Makes sense, right? So we started going through it, and then we noticed that, okay, step 4 and 6 and 10 and 25, actually it is just 18-step process. I made that up. But multiple steps in this process are not applicable to the use case we have. So we went back and we were like, okay, you know what, we don't have this thing, so what should I do? On the spot, the person in charge said, That's okay. Skip it. And I was like, no, hold on a second. What do you mean? Like, you cannot have a framework and on the spot just decide that it's okay, skip 3 steps. That goes back exactly to your question of who should be in the room and who should really make that decision. In my head, that was kind of like this moment of like, okay, I'm gonna just drop this call and I'm just gonna think about this for another 2 hours, and then maybe I come back and say, let's rethink this whole thing. But like in reality, that's a serious problem, because in their world, what is happening is that someone created a framework without knowing exactly why each step was in place. And then the moment that we said, okay, this doesn't apply, they were like, oh, okay, so it doesn't apply, just skip over it, it's good. As long as you just say that it doesn't apply, we're good. So to your question of who should be in the room, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, being like that educational or understanding piece. We need to, as people in charge, I think we need to understand what each of these acts, what each of these policies, the whole concept of, you mentioned privacy by design, everyone talks about it, and I'm sure many people or everyone in this room is comfortable with the concept. But like in reality, how many people can say what does it mean in practice? And I 100% I'm with you, Emily, in what you said. I can't agree more that do we ever get to that point that everyone is on the same page? I don't think so. But at least we need to put an effort to understand Bill C-26. What does it mean in practice? And to me, as a person whose English is not their first language, for me, like reading a bill like that is a nightmare, because many of those words for me are kind of like something that I'm not able to really connect with. But even if English is my first language, I have a feeling that in practice it's not clear. That's why I think that an organization who's creating that framework that I mentioned first should sit and say, this is the policy I'm following. These are not this. These are the policies we need to be compliant with. In our world, this is what it means to us. And Alex, you're in charge of this. Mary, you're in charge of that, and you are going to be in charge for these things, and like solid, set in the stone.
Thank you so much for the passion on this particular. No, seriously, it's really important. And one, I mean, we mentioned a few times who should be in the room. That brings me, Wendy, maybe to a question that I may raise with you, is the digital divide. Again, who should be in the room? When we prepared for, of course, our panel discussion here, we talked about men versus women, indigenous populations, and so forth. Can you, in this context, I mean, the Diversity Institute has done some amazing research there. Would you be so kind and maybe bring that lens to this conversation?
So, you know, the digital divide operates at multiple levels. Not just the governance level. I mean, historically, people have thought about the digital divide in terms of access to infrastructure, and we know that, for example, in indigenous communities, there are many places still without clean water. They certainly don't have high-speed internet access, and so when you're designing products or services, you have to take into account the fact that you can't assume access to basic infrastructure, but you also can't assume access to skills, knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the whole piece of data literacy, AI literacy, whatever it is you want to call it. And then the third thing is around affordability. And one of the things we found during COVID, for example, is as everything was shifting to digital, something like 42% of racialized kids in the city of Toronto did not have access to high-speed internet and were doing their homework on iPhones. Because of affordability issues to a large extent. So when we think about the digital divide, the first thing is to think about those fundamental issues around access and participation. You send out a call for consultations on AI policy. Who's going to be in the room? You look at who the advisory committee is, who is going to be in the room. So I think the same thing applies within organizations, and some of the models that have been developed around research ethics, data management in that context may have relevance in this context as well, where in addition to having a framework that looks at levels of access and sensitivity and looks at what the policies and programs are, thinking about who is or is not in the room becomes very important in terms of discussions of the appropriate use of data, because you can get people to sign things. And one of my pet peeves, some folks in government may be part of this, so I apologize. In the quest for data and randomized control trials, for example, some government departments are requiring participants in government-funded programs to share all of their data. And in some communities, particularly those that have been, subject to genocide and all kinds of forms of exclusion, exploitation, and so on, giving up personal data, relationships with big institutions are really problematic. So I think that's a piece of this that often isn't, like, what is consent? And very often what I would observe is we see a lot of coerced consent. We see a lot of people who aren't even in the system because of the access issues. And then the final dimension of this is, of course, when we're developing the systems, all of the issues around bias and how bias gets embedded. So I do think that bringing an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens to this complicates it without question. But if you don't start asking those questions, again, the public interest is not being served.
Yeah, 100%. Is there anything, Elnas or Emily, you wish to add to this particular topic? And I remember, I've seen you speak many times, Wendy, that this has been an ongoing issue for so many years. And I remember the one call or conversation or talk you gave when we haven't really made much progress, which is pretty sad, unless I do remember this incorrectly.
Well, yes and no. The other thing that's really interesting, we just did a survey twice of 5,000 people with environics. And when you look at AI adoption, guess what? Indigenous peoples, racialized people, and immigrants have higher adoption rates than others. And there is a gap between men and women, but it's much, much smaller than the gap you would see if you ask questions about coding. And why is that? Well, generative AI is kind of the English major's revenge. So it's really undermined the stranglehold that tech grads have typically had on these issues, and it's opened up both opportunities for access, but I think also opportunities for engagement in thinking about our future.
Mandy, you totally broke my heart.
Do we still have a few minutes? 3 minutes. 3 more minutes. Let's see if in that last, because we promised, so I like to keep promises, we wanted to quickly look at the global landscape in terms of legislation, but perhaps in terms of your views on, we used to have the AI Act ADA before. If we look at future AI legislation and what worked and didn't work in the past, are there any recommendations, what amendments should be made to the previous act we had, or how our future AI legislation should look? Is there a jurisdiction for us to follow, or maybe to stay away from, because we also learn from what not to do? Maybe any comments on that for the audience and for, of course, the consultation would be really appreciated. Emily?
I will keep this short given time. So I will say this. Yes, we should reintroduce an AI Act. Fundamentally, they need to make changes to what had been proposed. I don't think that's a surprise. Most thought that. The number one thing I would say is there needs to be an independent body overseeing this. There isn't any universe, and I can imagine that putting some AI commissioner within ISED provides the accountability, independence, and ethics necessary for this quickly evolving space. There also was, AI Act only really focused on high impact systems, and there's such a diversity of AI that wasn't accounted for within the Act, and that nuance needs to be captured. There also might be, and is, some AI that just should be no-go zones, and none of that was accounted for. It treated even the most high-risk AI as being something that you could just risk manage. And the last point I want to make is, guess who it didn't apply to? The public sector. That was just a miss. I mean, maybe it was trying to parallel privacy legislation, have a private one and a public one. But given where we're at, we can't proceed with AI legislation without also capturing government. Last point, Wendy, you said the EU was overly kind of complicated. I don't want to speak for you, but I thought that was a good point. And I would agree, we're seeing the growing pains over there, and also the lack of coherence. And how does the AI Act work with the Digital Services Act, and how do they overlap? And that is exactly the kind of complication that is going to have negative impacts on companies. So I think a Made in Canada version that maybe has the same basic framework is the ideal solution going forward.
Thank you. Wendy, anything? And I know you spoke about SMEs before as well. How do they fit into that whole framework?
Yeah, I think I would just echo what just was said. And I personally, and there may be exceptions, but in terms of no-go zones, I was at a conference where they were talking about autonomous weapons, for example. There are some really, that's why I said I'm fascinated, and I am also horrified, particularly during, in the current environment. That being said, I mean, one of the opportunities we have is with the big investments in defense, what was the Israel miracle in terms of entrepreneurship? It was the investments to a large extent in defense. And we do have some opportunities around dual purpose technologies and so on and so forth. But I think the no-go zones, like, we absolutely need to get some consensus around that. And the only other thing that has been flagged is making sure that we separate out things like certain digital harms don't belong in the AI legislation. They belong in the criminal code, and let's just deal with them there, because we're likely to get four-party consensus on moving some of that stuff through.
Perfect. Thank you. Great feedback. Elnas.
Very quickly, because I know we're at time. The only thing I would add to what was mentioned is actually a very lower level of analysis when it comes to this topic, and that is about architecture, about MLOps processes, about model lifecycle management. Usually when we're talking about policy, compliance, all those sorts of things, the first thing that comes to my mind, to everyone's mind, is operating model, strategy, privacy, very important topics, but usually these tiny yet important topics just fall off that list of how as a country we should think about data architecture. And this is particularly important because the last thing we want to do as a country is to do something, invest all this money, and then 3 years from today have to just wipe it off and restart the whole thing. That is a loss, and we don't want to do that. We need strategy and structure around data architecture, about MLOps, about our model management, and all those sorts of things, so that as different organizations, we can talk to each other. Because otherwise, what's the value of this technology? Okay, it's going to be better in my tiny world, but how can I advance that? The reality is that scaling AI is not, and I keep saying this, scaling AI is not about having more models, more solutions. No, it's not that. It's about scaling that trust that people are open to using it. It's that adoption.
No, you just triggered a thought, which is I think we have to really differentiate between what should be in legislation, which takes a long time to get in place, what should be in regulation, what should be in standards. Some of you probably lived through the development of the OSI models and so on, and it seems, and what should be in voluntary codes. I'm a big fan, frankly, of the Hiroshima process. It contains a lot of the same stuff as other guidelines for responsible AI, but I think calling it Hiroshima reminds us of the risks of technology gone awry. And so I think that's, I think we need to really be clear about what belongs in law, what belongs in regulation that can be readily changed. Where are we looking at standards, and where are we looking at voluntary codes and principles, and what are the guidelines for implementation? And we can't mix those up.
Well, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll be relatively quick. So, Marc, Etienne, nice to see all of you here today. Maybe a few words on procedurally how the task force is moving forward, just to inform kind of your own understanding of what our work is. There were roughly 20 of us who were named on the task force. We have a 30-day period to both consult with people informally and to ultimately draft our recommendations for the minister by November 1st, which is a Saturday. So I'm hoping that actually gives me up to the Monday morning to get it done. We were all given kind of specific areas of responsibility. That doesn't mean that we can't make recommendations more broadly on other aspects of a national AI strategy. But mine were specifically on sovereign AI infrastructure. And so I've been spending much of my time talking with people who have a point of view in this space and trying to inform as much as possible my memo, not only from my own perspective on these questions, but by kind of those of other Canadians who care on these files. Obviously, it's a complex thing to get through a lot of the hype and get through a lot of fuzzy terminology and get through a lot of marketing to also understand kind of what we are trying to solve for in the first place and what types of capabilities we have and what types of alternatives and what kind of strategies we want to deploy. The minister was quite clear in asking us to have big, bold ideas. It's part of why they went for a 30-day delivery timeline. Essentially, they didn't want us to all meet and kind of wash down our points of view to get one big consensus position. They expect the 20 members to have often conflicting positions go up, but they want those ideas to be as kind of crisp as they can be. A portion of the work is also, and this is just my own take on this, but figuring out the tactical steps to be able to execute against some of those higher level objectives. Is one thing to have, a strong objective for something as diffuse as sovereignty in the AI space. It's another to kind of properly define what you're trying to achieve and then the steps that you can take to try to get to that endpoint. All this within 30 days, so also a realistic take as to what we can accomplish. The work's not done on November 1st. We're meant to continue to engage with the minister on an ongoing basis with essentially conversations as requested by him or his staff. And then the minister has put in a self-imposed timeline of roughly 30 days after that to digest the different perspectives, also from those of people who've just submitted them through the open portal, as well as those of the task force. So procedurally, that's what's going on. Any questions on the procedural steps? No problem. If not, yep. Nice to see you.
Sorry, quick question. You said a self-imposed deadline.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if my voice gets. I just wanted to understand the tail end of your sentence. You said the minister had a self-imposed deadline of 30 days after receiving the input.
Yeah.
To what?
To produce the actual national AI strategy.
Seriously, to
Yes.
have it done. Oh, impressive.
Yeah. If I were to bet, there is a G7 ministerial on December 8th in Montreal on industry and tech. That would be a nice landing spot to make an announcement for an actual strategy. That's not to say that every program is tied up, that every sub-deliverable is, but I think it's circling a plane until you get to the landing strip, and successfully getting to lower and lower levels or closer to precision. I think that one will likely be much lower than in altitude than whatever is part of a budget announcement in a few weeks. No problem. I can talk about what I'm specifically doing on the sovereignty and AI infrastructure question. This is a work in progress, so by all means ask me questions if you or challenge me if you disagree with parts of this. But you have to understand in the first place what the actual demand for compute is and which components of that demand can be met by sovereign infrastructure, in quotation marks. I put the quotation marks because you also then have to define what you consider to be sovereign infrastructure. And that necessitates a pretty deep understanding of the AI stack from top to bottom and what your alternatives may be to the types of dependencies that you're trying to hedge against. So on the first part, on what the actual demand is, understanding the difference at the very basic level between training infrastructure and inference infrastructure. Those are, I don't know kind of what the varying levels are of understanding of the AI infrastructure space are in the room, but training, if you're trying to build a net new model, if you're trying to fine-tune a model, has a compute infrastructure that is different than the type of compute infrastructure that you will use for inference. Inference is when a model is in production. Say you're watching Netflix and it gives you a recommendation for the next movie, that model's in production. You're not trying to build a new model, you're working with an existing model. What the actual Canadian demand is on both sides of that compute is not a clear thing. So while we know that we want to have a greater degree of control over the stack, understanding the amount of compute that you actually need to meet that demand is one point. And the second layer is the degree to which it splits between training and inference, and a third, the degree to which that needs to be sovereign compute or not, depending on what you're trying to achieve. There's also a difference in the training space between folks who access training capacity at different layers of the AI stack. So if you actually get raw compute capacity, so GPUs, and you have a building, and you have networking capability between your GPUs, and you have megawatt supply into that building, the bare metal compute capability can allow you to train a model, but the number of organizations and the number of people in Canada who know what to do with bare metal compute are relatively low. And so matching what your domestic supply is, if you are looking to have a degree of domestic supply, to the type of people who can handle what you are offering them is another question. Most organizations access compute, whether on the inference side, or not so much on the inference side, but I'll stick to the training question, through intermediary layers of compute orchestration, of DevOps, so to support the development process of applications and so on. Without those intermediary layers, it's very difficult for most organizations to actually know what to do with that compute. And so that's another question of the sovereignty stack. It's one thing to be able to own a degree of GPU capacity, but are you building an Olympic stadium that no one uses? Or are you building something that's actually useful for people? And to what degree do you have the ability to offer those services or to layer the software stack on top of that, or the operationalization stack that allows people to then make use of that compute infrastructure? So that's yet another layer of complexity on top of that. So these are the types of questions I am struggling with and wrestling with, and then trying to find out not only what Canadian supply can be to match that demand, but also alternative models that provide a degree of hedge against risk of coercion, which is at the core of why there's been these sovereignty questions in the first place. So that doesn't necessarily have to be Canadian ownership. It can be, for instance, reliance on open source software as another form of hedge against dependency and lock-in. So went kind of deep there, guys, for a minute, but hoping it gives a little bit of color, the types of questions we have to ask ourselves, and also just how complex it is. I've got many people who've told me we need to spend at least $20 billion on new compute infrastructure. Well, $20 billion of public money is a very real ask when they can't fix, my kid's primary school. So let's try to make sure we're trying to match something that actually is both required, is useful, and meets the actual demand that we think that we have. Any questions, comments, concerns? Yep, at the back.
Yeah, I've been reading recently, so there were concerns about the fact that some people calling what's happening in AI a bubble. I also heard concerns about the fact that NVIDIA has deals where they're stimulating the demand for their own products in a way that's somewhat circular. I don't pretend to understand any of that, but I've just heard concerns being raised. So when you're trying to forecast demand, is it based on the current trajectory of the market, or is there how reasonable do you think these concerns are? And when we're trying to forecast demand, are we based on the current trajectory of the market, or is there kind of a zone that is based on also what might happen in regards to these concerns?
Yeah, a few questions in there. Am I worried about a bubble? Yes. I think it's a very realistic assessment of where we may be heading. But to be clear, kind of similar to the dot-com bubble. Dot-com bubble didn't mean the internet was useless and was never going to work out. There's a question between kind of how over-leveraged some components of the financing may be versus like the ultimate utility of AI. I have zero doubts about the ultimate utility of AI. I do have doubts about the financing infrastructure for components of AI, and frankly, mostly for training infrastructure questions. And part of that is built off of frontier questions. So if you're trying to play in the frontier model development game, you are playing at an exponentially different level of compute need than if you are playing at a level where you're trying to have enough domestic supply to train smaller models for specific applications, say in the mining sector, or if you are trying to just ensure that you have sufficient inference, which is a different type of computing infrastructure, as I was mentioning before. I think the bubble space is mostly in the training compute space, and frankly, mostly associated with frontier training. And just for an idea of scale, if you were trying to train a GPT-6 model level size right now, so something like in the trillion parameter model size, you would build compute infrastructure similar to what the Stargate compute infrastructure that OpenAI is building in Texas looks like. That is a roughly $500 billion project if it gets built to the degree that is they're aiming to build. With something 1/20th of that size, every company in Canada, every organization in Canada, not for profit, every government department, and throw in all of those equivalents from Australia as well, could train a 90 billion parameter model. Huge difference. So if you're not playing in the frontier game, then the questions are radically different as to what the objective is that you're trying to achieve and the amount of compute that you need. So you're pointing to a lot of important considerations. What I'd push back on is also just kind of unpacking what it is that you are trying to achieve. And so if you're not playing in the frontier game, which, spoiler alert, I don't think we should, specifically in providing compute infrastructure for frontier training, then the questions become very different. The other question that's an ancillary one to that is, how do you build, and that's the most complex one I would say, the project financing component of any infrastructure build out to take advantage to a certain degree of the amount of demand and of capital currently available in this space to create public advantage, essentially, versus missing the boat on that. And I will end with this, Franca. Like, here's a couple quick examples. The UK signed a deal a couple weeks ago. It was in the UK last week with the US, the kind of US-UK tech deal. Part of that, there was a Stargate, a mini Stargate cluster for OpenAI in the UK. It's a UK developer that is building out the compute infrastructure, so there's a degree of domestic value because N-Scale gets to build that out and gets compute investment, gets an anchor customer essentially for a data center build out. So that's not a bad thing, but that's essentially the end of the kind of public value component of that build out. OpenAI is building infrastructure for its own purposes, for its own model development needs, leveraging frankly limited megawatt availability in the UK. In parallel to that, there's a similar Stargate deal in Norway where the financing is brokered by Aker, which is like essentially a macro holding in Norway, similar to Brookfield, say in Canada, but where about 30% of the compute cluster's capacity is reserved for public use. So you could see that there's different financing models depending on how you structure the deal, where you still play with OpenAI because of the demand that they're bringing in as a kind of an anchor tenant, if you will. But depending on how you structure the deal, you can actually get a greater degree of public benefit. And so that's like the secret sauce that I think every country is trying to figure out. And it's a complex one, and because of the bubble component, potentially a short window to get that right too.
Yeah, I was just gonna, maybe I missed that question because I'd step out, but you mentioned that the government doesn't want to put $20 billion in, and I get that. Is there somebody on the task force that's looking how we get private investment and how we do tax reform in Canada, because that's what it's gonna take to get that private investment? Because I don't know why the government would put anything in, frankly. They should be, if this is a viable business, which it is, why would the government be putting any money into it?
To be clear, the government's going to do what the government does. I'm on the task force. I make my own recommendations. They will then make their own decisions. I am not a member of the government. I don't think that they should put $20 billion on something that is, purely publicly financed in the current context. I think there's better outcomes than that. As to if people are looking at private investments, I think they are. The sovereignty layer of the consideration is where you get a bit of a wrinkle on that. Depending on your interpretation of sovereignty, if you go straight to the baseline Westphalian state, then you're going to say, well, the physical infrastructure is in my country, ergo, ultimately, I control it in one way or another. Or you go several layers above that. Well, is that infrastructure actually U.S. owned or owned by another entity? In which case, what is the degree of control that I actually have on it? And alternatives in a worst case scenario, which is kind of the additional layer that we're being asked. If it's just about unleashing private sector investment, then all you would do is copyright reform. Because frankly, copyright liability is is the greatest hindrance to CSB investments in training compute infrastructure. When they build it out and they look at different jurisdictions, Japan has a very clear text and data mining exemption. Japan got it, don't quote me on this number, but I think it's $80 or $90 billion of private sector investment in training compute infrastructure. But that's because it's a place where people feel it's safe to train a model. If you train a model in Canada, it tends to be seen as the most potentially legally risky jurisdiction in which to train a model with regards to copyright liability. And so why would you build infrastructure if then everybody says, if I train my model there, I'm exposing myself to billions and billions and billions of dollars of potential fines? That's a basic question of how this market is functioning. It depends what you're trying to achieve. So that's part of my recommendations is be crystal clear on what you are trying to achieve, be as precise as you can, and people in government are trying to do this work as well, as to what the different categories of the stack are and places in that stack where you can play or build a credible alternative, and then have a difference between what you do today and then what you do in 3 years and 5 years and 7 years and what your plan is over that duration. I think that's an important component as well. All of this rests on essentially scaling laws. Scaling laws are the idea that the more data that you put into, the more compute that you have, the more the models are going to perform. It makes sense for the NRC to stimulate research in this space that looks at alternative architectures where they don't rely on scaling laws for performance. And then you've just in a second democratized who can play in this game, because right now it's really a two-horse game if you're thinking about the frontier game. So again, lots of different questions are kind of understood under the umbrella of sovereignty, AI infrastructure, and trying to unpack those in under a month, and have about 8 days left to draft those recommendations.
Do you have time for
Two more questions, sure.
Just a quick question about power. The megawatts required, is this private infrastructure investment, or are you leveraging the public utility network? What's the model there?
In Canada, currently there's the example we're giving is TBD, right? I don't know what the ultimate model the government will pick for a potential kind of build out. The way that cloud service providers work depends on the jurisdiction. So in a place like Alberta, they'll allow you to actually do your own private energy build outs, and you can be behind the fence, as they call it, to power your data center. So for instance, AWS in the US, bought or ensured the continued survival of a nuclear power plant and built the data centers right on that nuclear power plant. In a place like Quebec, because of the nature of the Hydro-Quebec monopoly, you have to purchase your hydroelectricity directly from the provider like any other industrial player would. And then it's a question of kind of megawatt allocations based on industrial preferences of that jurisdiction, plus the ability to pay. In pretty much every jurisdiction on Earth, because of the amount of demand for AI compute infrastructure, any megawatt availability is claimed. It's just about who gets preferential access to that megawatt availability. It's also why you tie a lot of energy development to AI infrastructure plays going forward.
Last question.
Perfect. So I've got the last question, the pressure. It's not a procedural question, but a back to basics question.
Yeah.
The panel before you talked about maybe we don't actually have common understanding of basic concepts like access and privacy and AI sovereignty. So do you share the same, and Elna's pointed it out, I was wondering if you have the same thought, and is that something that the task force is actually, going back to this fundamental basic question, and what is the government's perspective on AI sovereignty?
So again, I am not the government, so I can't speak to the government's point of view. I can't even speak to the task force point of view because we were all asked to have our individual thoughts, and they specifically didn't want us to collaborate. So I can give you my thoughts on that. So I just want to be clear so that people don't interpret that my point of view is the government's point of view. I hope it will in 30 days, but no guarantees on that front. So it's true that, as I was laying out before, sovereignty means radically different things to many different people, and depending on who you're talking to, it's leveraged for marketing purposes by many different organizations, and that's not exclusive to Canada either. I think we need to boil down what the actual objective is of what we're trying to achieve when we talk about sovereignty, and I think it's actually like a series of objectives, what the trade-offs are in trying to achieve that objective, and then what the different tactics are to try to get to ultimately what you're trying to achieve. Now, this all sounds like saying a lot of words that don't mean anything, but practically speaking, if you were trying to say tomorrow morning, we don't want to work with cloud service providers, we're going to build that entire stack domestically, the R&D spend of AWS is greater than the entire private sector spend on R&D in Canada. That's not a moonshot. That's like 1,000 moonshots. Okay, but if you look, like I said, at like raw compute capacity, like bare metal, that's actually, there's not much of a moat there. There's companies like Hypertech that have deals with NVIDIA, can do straight build-outs, can frankly get preferential megawatt access over most cloud service providers. You can provide that. So if you're worried about training compute capabilities to support Mila and Vector and those types of organizations, maybe a couple of big banks, that's not that hard to solve for. If you're worried about broad dependencies of people like, I'm inventing this is not a real use case, but say Canadian Tire or Tim Hortons, they use like Canadian staples, and their ability to access AI capabilities, they are not accessing that through bare metal compute. They're accessing that through those intermediaries. So in their context, what does sovereignty mean? And what's the actual risk that you are perceiving in the first place? Is it, some people have pointed to the Cloud Act. I think the Cloud Act is a red herring. I don't think it's an actual real problem or a more of a different problem than it is for any other Canadian supplier. Are you worried about kill switches or kind of political coercion based off of your dependencies on US-based infrastructure and how that could be leveraged against you in a trade negotiation? That's a different set of considerations. It's not a Cloud Act-based one. Are you going to be okay, Franca? No. Okay. So you also have to be real as to what it is you are kind of pivoting against. And then to add yet another layer of complexity, this is often really kind of an industrial policy play in different language. It's about like, well, if we're going to spend $100 either of public money or of private sector but Canadian money on AI infrastructure costs, how many of those dollars are staying within Canada? Different question. Is that a sovereignty question in the sense of control, or is that a sovereignty question in the sense of creating wealth, improving, or is it improving domestic productivity through access to latest and greatest tools? It depends how you define it, and they're each real important questions. I think that's it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then maybe you have a few thoughts about the broad spectrum of our topics, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Craig McClellan. I'm the CEO and founder of ThinkOn. We've been delivering sovereign cloud services to the federal government and several provincial governments since, well, 7 years, whatever the math is on 7 years. I have opinions. Some will come out today, some won't. But I can tell you that, I agree a bit with what Marc said earlier about some of the U.S. regulations and laws are being overplayed. But at the end of the day, we have an obligation to develop the Canadian economy and support Canadian businesses and Canadian citizens, and we have to think through that lens, I believe, every day when we make decisions. And I'll just make one other quick editorial comment that there was a question about a bubble earlier on. I'll share a little anecdotal story just for a second. As you can imagine, as a cloud service provider with operations in Australia, the US, Canada, the Caribbean, and the UK, a lot of people know who I am. I've had 3 neo cloud infrastructures shopped to me in the last 2 weeks that are about to fail financially. So if there's a little anecdotal evidence of what's going on out there with respect to a bubble, there is some real world evidence starting to appear.
Hi, I'm Vince Silvestri, Vice President Software at Evertz, the sponsor of this event. We're actually the country's largest OEM manufacturer that nobody knows about. We come from the broadcast space. We are the majority of the employees and all the manufacturing happens here in Canada, actually in Burlington and just outside of Toronto as well. And I've been with the company for 25 years. And I've seen it grow from 75 to the 2,400 we are today. And I think I was the 3rd software guy there. So I've been basically a code nerd for a long time, graduated McMaster from computer science, and I've been dabbling and playing with AI. In fact, you mentioned Geoffrey Hinton. I got to see his papers long before he was who Geoffrey Hinton is today. And so I've been playing with this stuff for a long time and very proudly Canadian. So as a company and as an individual, so this is a very meaningful panel to me and to our company.
Great, thanks. My name is Erin Kelly, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Advanced Symbolics. Our AI is Polly. She's an AI for market research. We've been in business for 9 years, so again, I guess that's something we all have in common. We didn't just jump on the AI bandwagon when ChatGPT came out. Our company has nothing to do with that. We're not a generative AI, we're a cognitive AI. We're based in Canada, do all of our R&D in Canada, almost all of our employees. We have employees here and in the United States, across Canada, in the US. I do business in 22 different countries. So while I'm a Canadian company, I also consider myself to be a global company. And that's the challenge for me that we're going to talk about today, I hope. And I also want to say something that came up on the last panel is DEI, diversity. Who should be at the table? Business should be at the table. And I find too often we don't have business at the table when we're looking at policy and legal and academic and all of that. Business people have to be at the table as well. And hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that too, because that's what this is about the economy, I think, at the end of the day.
All right, thank you. Which procurement levers, mandatory controls, valuation credits for sovereignty, that sort of thing, would best enable trusted adoption of AI?
Let me take a stab at that. Well, first of all, I'll say that a procurement dollar is worth 3 times a grant dollar to business people, at least 3 times, because we can turn that into a multiplier effect, both from an investment perspective, but also from the way we actually attract other investors to us. So there's that lever of procurement versus grant dollars. The second thing I'll tell you is there's an opportunity to change, or let's say pivot, the way procurement's handled. And I realize most people have a bad opinion of procurement. I'm going to state it a little differently. Canadian suppliers want to solve problems. Foreign suppliers want to sell you stuff. And fundamentally, that is one of the cruxes of differentiation when you deal with domestically led organizations. You've got 3 senior people from 3 different companies here on the stage, all domiciled in Canada. And we're here to help solve problems. And procurement can change the rules just by saying, here's the problems I need to solve, as opposed to, lots of talk quietly amongst international suppliers, and they come up with a Byzantine list of requirements that no one really understands because no one understands the fundamental problem. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you both have strong opinions.
Oh, I'll double down on that. There was actually a theme, right? What's the problem? The definition of the problem. We're talking about sovereignty and all, but I couldn't agree more. In procurement, a lot of times there's a half, here's some of the attributes, but give us the problem. I mean, as a company, I said we're the largest OEM nobody knows anything about is because we're a company built and run by engineers. And all we want to do is actually solve real problems in really sometimes cool ways. And that's exactly right. I think you just want clarity of what the actual problem is we're solving. And I say this to my team all the time. What's this for and who's this for? And if we can get really clear on that, then we stand a chance. Because we've got a lot of bright minds in this country. And if procurement can be very, very, very clear, this is a problem I have with even our customers. Once they are clear, usually we can knock it out of the park.
Double down. I mean, so many times I've gone with my company. We have sold to the government. We do big important work with the government. Foodborne illness in Canada. We had a salmonella outbreak in Canada 18 months ago. It was cantaloupe salmonella. That was our AI that discovered it was salmonella and that it was the cantaloupes and got the cantaloupes off the shelves. 7 people died in that outbreak. It would have been north of 60 without this early warning system. It's so successful that the CDC in the US adopted it and said we're 6 weeks ahead of anything they have in the United States at doing those types of things. So very, very important work, very groundbreaking work, and we're well recognized in the government. It still takes forever for us to get things procured, even with big fans. And so I'm on the ethical AI list. You can procure up to $9 million with my company. You think I can get anything through that list? No, right? So then I was told, well, get on with, go get a partner like Microsoft or, okay, fine, did that. Of course, now they're being shut down because they're not sovereign AI. You know what? Just tell us what we need to do. Be clear. You need to sign these T's and C's, or you need to do this. It's not clear. Get on this list. Oh, no, that's not good enough. Okay, well, just tell us what we need to do. I mean, that's really the business is very, we're very, just tell us what it is, and we'll do it. But the government is not clear about what you need to do to follow the procurement rules there. So we just basically wait for the government to come to us if they have an issue. We don't do any RFPs or anything like that.
Now, which workloads or data sets should be the first movers for sovereign trusted AI, and which should wait?
Keep going the same order. Let's go reverse.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this kind of came up in the last panel, and I think it was Esma. Well, everybody commented on it. I think we have to understand not everything needs to be private. Okay, I mean, if I'm an influencer and I'm putting my stuff out on TikTok, I don't want that to be private. Right? I want everybody to see it. I don't want the government to say, well, we don't want that to be on a US server. No, I want everybody to see it. There's really very little data that I'm hyper concerned about. Everybody always talks about marketing data. Let me just say a little bit of a thing about PII and marketing data. The last thing you want is PII and marketing data. I'll give you a little example as to why. I was presenting at a conference not too long ago, and there were going to be 40 executives in the room. It was for this company. And I said to the organizer, okay, so there'll be 32 people there. She was very offended. No, I said there are going to be 40. If we say we're going to have 40 people there, there'll be 40 people there. Okay, when I got into the room, there were 33 people, okay? I can tell you with high certainty that 20% are not going to come. It's February, there's a snowstorm, my kid's sick, what have you, okay? There's always 20% who don't come. I can't tell you what 20% it'll be, or it'll cost me too much money to calculate that. So when it comes to marketing, you're much better off with that aggregated data. If I try to stalk Vince, okay, oh, Vince likes to drink Malbec wine, okay, now Vince is dating somebody else and that person doesn't drink Malbec, so now he's on to something else, okay? So at a micro level, at that level, it's very expensive for me to stock Vince, and it's not worth it. Sorry, it's just not. But what I want to do is say people like Vince, okay? And I want to get that demographic info. That's why we do market research at that level, not because we can't do it at the PII levels, because it's not worth it. There's too much randomness, there's too much chaos. So PII is not valuable. Where PII is valuable is in like crime. I want to find out if Vince is, laundering money. It's not about people like Vince, it's Vince, right? And we've had issues like this where the police have gone to Rogers and got cell phone data without warrants. That's a problem, but that's been going on for decades. But that's where you have the PII, and I think that's where we need to have those conversations. But we've been needing to have those conversations for a long time and not really been having them, and now it's kind of surfacing with AI, but it's been a problem that we've always had. Your cell phone data is much more valuable than your Twitter data. Okay, let me just put it that way.
Yeah, I think, I'm probably not actually, have the right expertise to comment on specifically which data sets, but I think obviously anything that deals with our health, privacy, and safety, those things should be near the top of the list. But I think this is where we do need these task force and governments and other agencies to tell us, like, okay, what are the problems that are worth tackling? Start prioritizing the data sets and workloads that are sensitive, and then let industry at it. Like we supply network switches. People thought we were crazy to build a network switch. We did it for media-specific things, but they're high-volume data workloads. And like, why would you do that? Well, it was worth it to our customers to not go to Arista or Cisco, nothing against their products, but we could build something that was specific to them. So that was a priority of data sets and workloads that we needed to act upon. And so it's hard for us in industry to know all the ones. Everyone's gonna have motivations and self-incentivized for certain things, but we do need all the various people at the table, what we heard in the last panel, to start saying, hey, these are the ones that can be used or misused by bad actors, wherever they are. And these are the ones that need to be protected and sovereign. So I think that's a hard thing for industry to decide. But I think anything that can obviously harm us as a country or as individuals obviously is high on the list. But again, I don't think I can definitively answer that, Paul.
Maybe what I could add is one observation. The Privacy Act hasn't been updated since email was invented. Just a little anecdotal piece of evidence about maybe an area where we should be spending some quality time. So one of the things that Canada, I think, constantly brings to the table is this level of trust that lots of jurisdictions have either failed on or are in the process of failing on. I appreciate the comments Marc made earlier about copyright reform. If you're a publisher, I actually think you might be happy about copyright laws the way they are. Because why should you feed into a public model that trains for economic benefit that you don't derive any value from yourself? Just a comment on that. In the context of data in general, though, the federal government could actually do us all a great service if we establish one consistent data classification process for all levels of the public sector. So data that's considered protected, be at the federal level, is often considered completely open source, public domain at the provincial level, and frankly, who knows what happens at the municipal level. And these sorts of classification standards can really set us apart if we're going to attract global workloads for private model processing. Forget training, think about private inferences, probably the single biggest opportunity. But the real issue we have right now is a very outdated Privacy Act and a completely missing classification process across all levels of the public sector. That's where I would start. And then I would kind of wrap up by saying we have to remind the world that we are the trustworthy people, and we will attract workload to this market as opposed to exporting good jobs somewhere else because we have cheap power. We need to think about the entire value chain as it relates back to data, because this is one of the areas where we could actually shine.
I was actually going to just add to that, like, I saw something relatively recently, the typical thing is we think about privacy, security, data, data security. We think about someone has access, they're being given permission to access certain things. We deal with, we have a bunch of military customers, and this is the thing. But there's a flip side you can think about it is, instead of thinking about who has access to what, is like, where is this data allowed to go? think about it from the data first. And it's actually starting to find its way into computer systems where, hey, this data is allowed to go here and allowed to go there. And once it goes here, this person's now in an enclave. So I think that's a different way to think about it. I think the data sets are probably actually easier to identify and then start identifying where they're actually allowed by even maybe building it into the systems, building it into the data centers, building it into maybe even that middleware that Marc was speaking about. Maybe that is an opportunity for us. Right? We think, okay, yeah, AWS spending millions of dollars to build this middleware of all the orchestration and stuff, but that's actually also where they're creating the vendor lock-in. Right? You have all hosts of developers in the world who only know how to write cloud applications for AWS. Well, that's a problem in and of itself. And so if we start thinking the other way around and inverting the pyramid, maybe we have a better chance.
You've anticipated one of my questions here. How should we measure public trust and service outcomes in AI-enabled programs? Vince, do you want to start?
Yes, that again.
Okay, how should we measure public trust and service outcomes in AI-enabled programs?
That's a good one. So, I mean, obviously adoption rates, but I think the bigger thing is, actually, this is an issue I have, even just developing product day to day, which is, how do you actually measure success? How do you know a product is doing what it's intended to do? And one of the places that I think we can do a really interesting work, and you know, I always kind of get allergic reactions to things like policy, because policy requires compliance. But I'd rather by design. You know, we build test frameworks for things to prove that the product is doing what it does. I think what we should be thinking about is are there tests, ways, you know, think of them like programs we could run on our data, on our data sets, on our infrastructure as a whole in a country to prove that we're reliable, right? Like that's a lot of times what we have to do. You know, we get product certified for various security policies, common criteria, these sorts of things. We actually have to prove by like not just inspection, not just by, hey, yes, signing and checking boxes, but like literally prove that, yes, our randomized data is truly, truly random. We have to go through those things. I would love to see something where, I mean, that's to me where government can spend a lot of, and can spend a lot of interesting work saying, hey, instead of us trying to like write policy and legislation and things like that, why don't we do this? Why don't we create incentives? And why don't we say, here's the thing that we're going to prove that what you said is true. And then we're going to show the world that we build these systems that are in fact provability, like with the proof that it's doing what we say. I think that'd be a really interesting area of research that we should get many levels, including academia, involved in. Because it's a problem, open problem in software, and it's an open problem in reliable systems.
Erin, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I think just building on what Vince said, it's measurement, right? Like I mentioned earlier, the foodborne illness in Canada, we forecast that, and then it comes true. We get the cantaloupe off the shelves, and the deaths and the sicknesses go down. And so we're always, with our customers, we always ask our customers, before we start the project, what would success look like to you? What is it you're hoping to achieve? Now, sometimes our customers, it's funny, they want to hold that very close to their chest, right? Like, oh, I don't want to tell you what. No, but it's important for us to know that, because then when that's achieved, you'll know that you've achieved it. It's really, really important to us. We're a measurement company. So we forecast a measurement, or we look for a measurement. We have a module in our software called impact analysis, and we always measure the impact of things. And we say to the customer, don't tell us what your sales were. We're going to tell you. And they go, oh, my God, and it's true. Now, to that point, I think our government also, I mentioned that we did this work for PHAC in Canada. They actually took the initiative to tell the CDC about our work, which I thought was fantastic. Usually, though, government doesn't do that. They like, oh, no, we don't want to recommend you. We don't want to do anything like that. They did in this case because it was kind of life-saving work. But even when it's not life-saving work, I think if our companies are doing great work for the government should be a reference customer. You know, we should be singing our praises and talking about our companies and the great things they do, especially now. We don't have to worry about Kuzma anymore, apparently, so we can just like sing our own praises, and a government can praise our companies. And that, like Craig said, is worth a lot more than any grant money. I don't need your $20 billion. I'd love to have you as a reference, though. I'd love for you to say they did this and they were successful at it. And then we don't have the doom and gloom about AI all the time. That's the other thing, right? It drives me crazy. Every time I'm watching a Hollywood movie, the AI is evil and killing people. Hey, listen, AI saves lives. AI gets you on your Google Maps from A to B. Where would you be without AI? I mean, it's almost always for good. Yes, you can use anything for evil, but almost all the AI we're using today is benefiting people. So we need to start talking about that more.
Just a quick comment to take what's already been said by Vince and Aaron. I think we're going to start to see a circle forming. I love your cantaloupe story, despite it being sad, because you didn't have to use the word AI to really get a strong symbol in one's mind about the value you provided in that case. And I think that we're going to see, when eventually this AI bubble wears off, or whatever you want to call it, we're going to see a resurgence of really intelligent outcomes. And what's going to be cool about that is anyone that's been in this business longer than 2 years is going to be able to circle back to all the great things you learned before AI was really an element of surprise. And that was, did the outcome meet or exceed the need? And I look at things inside our infrastructure that we deliver to the federal government or the provincial government, and oddly enough, there's a lot of AI hanging around in there already, and it still boils down to the outcomes. And did you improve something? Did you avoid something? Did you deliver economic value to the ultimate paying customer? That's always going to be strong.
What's the role of Canadian suppliers and R&D in strengthening resilience and competitiveness?
Guess it's back to me. So I've said to anyone that'll listen to me, so thank you for listening, is that there's so much innovation capacity in Canada. We outweigh so many other markets around the world with our innovation, yet we have to continually take that innovation to other markets in order to be recognized. Part of it is there's a upside down risk reward issue in the public sector in Canada where people are afraid to take risks. There is the only thing better than having wild success is having wild failure quickly. And we could avoid a lot of embarrassment if we actually engaged with Canadian suppliers. The second part I'll make is, I think it was Minister Solomon said this, we can't have AI in a vacuum, we have to work with the rest of the world. I totally buy into that. But I'll tell you a little story. Back in 2018, when we signed the framework agreement for cloud services as the only Canadian company, I had to wait months for Microsoft and AWS to negotiate an agreement with US lawyers. I signed the framework agreement in 48 hours. Now, why on earth wouldn't a Canadian supplier be put at the front of the list to actually give us an economic advantage? Regardless of trade agreement, there's nothing stopping public sector in Canada from putting Canadian vendors at the front of a list. We're not talking about exclusivity or any favoritism other than why not put them first to give us a starting pole position from which we can actually perhaps have some earlier success instead of waiting for a delay tactic from US lawyers.
Yeah, so you're asking about the role we can play?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, Craig, I like what you said, because believe me, we battle. Sarkis and I were talking about the same thing today. We battle that. It's harder to sell sometimes to Canadian customers than it is to the American customers, to European customers. I mean, it's frightening, in fact. That building across the space right over there sometimes is hard to sell into. It's the truth. And we are like, and it's not like we're, oh, nice little cozy story about some Canadian startup. No, we are like world class. Everywhere else, we are in the top venues, the top everything. And it's like, and yet I'm trying to go sell into a CFL stadium, and it's like I got to like prove that we're real, right? And it makes no sense. It makes no sense. So I think it's kind of like we have to band together in a lot of ways, like Canadian companies buying from other Canadian companies, not out of some charity or something, but like recognizing we have world-class things here being built by Canadians here, right? Like to not put you to the front of the list, to look at that, at least say, hey, is there a Canadian alternative? I can tell you there are other countries in the world that do this. There are products in our industry that never leave Japan, made by companies like Panasonic and Sony, that are just for the Japanese market. And you go to any one of the broadcasters there, it's filled with that stuff, and it never leaves the place, never leaves the country. And I'm not saying we get to that level of nationalism, but I mean, I think to at least put us at the top of the list and not like make us fight and crawl up to the top is crazy. It is just absolutely nuts. So I think, you know, as a leadership position and then working with our wonderful Canadian university system and college system, we have, again, trained some of the best minds in the world. People come from all over the world to train at these same schools and to allow industry to like create a virtuous circle between industry, school, government, businesses together and to, again, put us at the top of the list because of that, I think would be massive.
Yeah, it's much easier to sell to Americans than to sell to Canadians. My first customers were American. Now, I say the best market in Canada is Quebec because they're like Americans. And I think it's because they get ignored a lot, you know, because of the language. Je suis bilingue, alors je peux jaser en français comme tout le monde. So I use that to my advantage when I go into Quebec. So, but I'll give you a true story. My first sale was to an American. I had tried to sell in Canada first, and you know we didn't have customers. So the first thing they would ask me is 9 years ago. Well, who else is using your software? Nobody. Oh, well, come to me when you've got like reference customers. Okay. So I go down to the U.S. Who else is using your software? Nobody. He's like, you mean I'm the first? Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Because they see right away. Yes, it gives them an advantage to be the first. You get a price advantage, you get a technology advantage, you get a first to market advantage. So that to me, and you know, that's the difference between Americans and Canadians. Canadians are, who else is doing it? I don't want to be the first. Americans are, I absolutely want to be the first because it gives me an advantage.
Actually, I just want to add something. I read something recently that I found was very entertaining, also because I'm Italian. So Franca, you and I. The author wrote, if you're a startup and you go bankrupt in Italy, there's probably a criminal investigation, right? We're not too far off from that. In Silicon Valley, the day after, you're getting a phone call to start the next thing. And it's, yes, there's money in Silicon Valley. I get all that. But it's the mindset of like, okay, that didn't work. We proved one other thing that didn't work. Still good, smart people. Let's go to the next and to the next. Rinse and repeat. I saw there was an iterative approach. People talk about an iterative approach in the last panel. We have to adopt that in industry to say, that's okay. All right, one way it failed. Doesn't mean you're dummy. Doesn't mean, you know, you're criminal. Means, okay, you found something that didn't quite work, but there's probably some good things you can take from there, some good people. Try again. And that's the spirit we need to really just, I think, excel in this country.
Could I add one more quick thing? Sorry. It's a real world story. I was talking to someone from economic development in Ontario in the life sciences space. And I was saying to him, you know, you're looking for ways to get money out into the system through grants and loans and things like that. You know, at the exact same time, the Ministry of Health, or Ontario Health, was issuing RFPs that made it impossible for an Ontario-based company to bid on something because they were so determined to have GE Medical. I shouldn't name people, but I'll just say it was clearly written for that. And what I found really interesting was, and I think this applies federally as well, the consumption departments, the people that spend the money, don't spend enough time talking to the department that wants to give out grant money to figure out how you double down on the spend. So it kind of links back to what I said earlier about spending versus grants. You know, we talk about a budget problem in Ottawa. It actually, a lot of it could be solved just by looking at the way we are combining those spends or not combining those spends to drive economic advantage, which is going to drive payroll taxes, is going to drive income tax, it's going to drive a whole bunch of other revenue sources at the country level in Canada, that if we just got ISED and the consumption ministry departments talking, for example.
So how can departments balance cost versus performance versus security? Which tiered models or trade-offs make sense?
Oh, is that me?
Yeah.
This is so hard to say because I've never actually worked in government. Well, cost versus
performance versus security.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that depends on the project, right? I mean, ideally, if you have a high-performing project, it's saving you cost. I mean, and that's something we always go into right away. And when it comes to security, well, here's the other thing. I told you we were on the list for ethical AI. We're level 3. We've had the tires kicked on us because we do and have done work for public health and for Health Canada, we had all of that. We were up at Parliament Hill and we had all the investigation. They looked at our architecture. Okay, so that's been done. And yet every time it's like we're starting from scratch. Well, we're worried that you're going to be collecting PII. Well, we don't do that. Oh, okay, you know, we have to go through this all over again for every single engagement. So it should be like if you're on the list for ethical and secure AI, how long does that last? I mean, does it like I have to go through this every time we're bidding on something? And then I think the costs and the delivery. I think we need more people who are doing procurement who understand AI, first off, because I do find a lot of them, there's a lot of misconceptions. They think everything's Gen AI, for example. They think everything's hallucination. They think, you know, everything is, you know, when you're talking about public data, as I'm doing with me for market research, security is not really an issue. It's all public data. So there's none of this is, I'm not looking at people's private health data. I'm looking at things they've posted. And we only take publicly available data. So it really just depends on case by case. It doesn't, you know, the cost and the performance are pretty evident, I think, with the stuff that we're doing.
Three quick comments. One is I think we host 42 different departments on our infrastructure for some application. We've done 42 ATOs, which is crazy. Because it actually is only 3 applications. There should be 3 ATOs. So back to your point earlier about the constant review, there is a very interesting economic engine around the authority to operate and the security reviews, because you always start from the position of being untrusted, regardless of how many times you've proven you're trusted, and despite your alignment to guardrails that are Canadian defined. One item. Second item is NIST. Does everyone know what NIST is? They're standards that the government of Canada tends to adopt very often. NIST actually rolls up to the Department of Commerce in the U.S. So if you think about how to influence economic advantage globally, that's what I would have done too if I was America. So here we are trying to adhere to standards that actually are not designed to make our lives easier. They're designed to make the competitors to American vendors harder. And the third thing I'll say is the supply chain integrity. So Vince's company and my company, we're starting to work on a collaboration. So we're going to throw out the foreign product and put in the Canadian product. We're doing the same thing on the compute side right now. And I think that if we all work together, we could have amazing supply chains that were incredibly powerful and so easy to understand, versus the Byzantine world of bringing in technology from anywhere abroad. Forget the U.S. Anywhere abroad, you've got to deal with a opaqueness around your supply chain. It is the time for Canadian organizations and the public sector to collaborate on supply chains that ultimately can be exported. And that's really the real trick here is if we do it right domestically, this becomes an export engine as opposed to what it is today, where we export engine first, and then we try to somehow shoehorn it back into Canada.
Yeah, I'm going to just double on a couple of things you said. So yeah, AI, defining what AI is, everyone's, the word is, actually the field is about 60, 70 years old. It's been around since the beginning of computers pretty much. It was one of the first things they thought they could do with it, and artificial intelligence was coined back then. So I think everyone thinks ChatGPT, Gen AI, but actually those are the ones that are probably most likely in the bubble and most likely to be near the end. If you look into if you really look into it deeply. So whatever we talk about here, we have to think about what's beyond all this, what we're calling this Gen AI. But there are a lot of other workloads that can be highly performant if we're very clear about it. So back to your question, Paul, about performance. I think if we're clear about defining the problem, we can build performance, and incredible performance, almost sometimes industry-changing performance on some of this stuff. While everyone's trying to build all these huge inference things on these large LLMs, there's all sorts of areas of AI and other data workloads and automations that can be tremendously accelerated with specific technology applications. Some of the stuff Craig and our company are working on together, for example. And then what that does is that if you get tons and tons of performance, technology becomes a huge lever, which then automatically reduces price. So the more useful it becomes, the more more widely gets adopted. Therefore, it creates a virtuous cycle. Now, security is obviously antagonistic to some of those things because it eats into some of the performance often, right? And so that's a balance, and that does depend, going back to what was said before about what does need to be secure, and then what could be accelerated. And it's challenging. I mean, Craig, you know, in the data centers, you can say, oh, the network's secure, but yeah, then the workloads are sometimes in the clear inside the servers, and then are those servers shared? And there's a bunch of factors there, and it's really complicated. We could go on for a long, long time. So I think security is kind of separate from cost and performance, but if we can drive performance up enough that the applications we make are world-changing, then price will come down automatically, particularly for Canadians first. And I think that's a huge deal.
What minimum operational controls should be non-negotiable? Things like residency, encryption, incident response. Who wants to take that?
Honestly, I think right now we need to be flexible. I mean, this is early days. I mean, encryption, I mean, again, it's going to depend, right? Nothing that I do really needs to be encrypted, I don't think, as I'm working with publicly available data. To the extent, so for example, in the PHAC study, no, it was all, even the wastewater data that we were sucking up was all kind of, there's nothing secret about that. So I think you really need to understand all the stacks and all the layers and what you're doing, and ask yourself, first of all, do I need to be Fort Knox here, or whatever the Canadian equivalent of that is? And then if you do, you kind of have to the extent that we can bless something and say it's good, go on there. But I think right now it's very early days, and it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all for every project.
So something interesting happened earlier this week. It's been all over the media. Everyone knows about the AWS issue. Whatever. The outages happen all the time. What I found really interesting was how many Canadian entities were affected by a service provider that claims residency and sometimes actually tries to declare sovereignty, which is even more bizarre. But just think about the implication of not having clarity around your supply chain for a second. And when something as strange as a DNS error can occur in the northeastern U.S. and can actually take out Wealthsimple, one of our shining stars of domestic, progress, that to me is really concerning, because now we know we're dealing in an ecosystem where suppliers aren't necessarily being transparent or honest. So my answer to your question is, I think it starts with having clarity around the perimeter in which you operate. So, for instance, when we were awarded a contract slot, one of the things I committed to was federal workload does not cohabitate with Joe's Pizza Shop on a piece of infrastructure sitting in Quebec City. I could do that because to me it made economic sense. More importantly, I didn't want to get the call from the president of Shared Services 6 months later when we find out that something beyond the guardrails design resulted in something weird happening, like what just happened. So my answer is, you start with a hard perimeter, and if we're devoted and committed to sovereignty, well, the hard perimeter is the border. What occurs inside the border, as long as it can be controlled, managed, reported, and observed, then to me that fits into the control mechanics. Anything more ambiguous than that at this point in time, given how many moving parts and misrepresentations that are actually out there, that have been out there for years, to me is just a matter of time before something really bad happens. And when I say really bad, we can imagine, now does layer into that a little bit of uncertainty in some other entities globally, and things could get chaotic really fast.
Always comes down to DNS, doesn't it? Always. It's true. Look it up. That or BGP, one of the two. I think encryption or cryptography, I think a lot of this stuff is about, they are application specific, and I actually don't know if you can govern it or mandate it as much. I mean, I think that's very application specific. I mean, look, everyone's got how many different chat programs you got on your phone, just as an example. Let's just use that very practical example, right? Now, if you're Telegram, they talk about the chain of custody of the data. It's encrypted on your phone. Even an employee of that that entity couldn't even look at it if they wanted to, and if they had physical access to the server. Okay, that's interesting, but that's for messaging application. What happens when you do need to pull that data apart and it's sitting on a shared workload? And like, it's a very complicated topic, right? We learned WhatsApp is not actually really protected. In fact, it's just got the appearance of being protected because Facebook removed those protections, even though it used to be like. So there's a lot of things here, but they are application specific. I think what we can do though is, and this is some of the work that we're doing, we can provide better infrastructures that we have control over and can protect to put things in enclaves or protect workloads and putting them on dedicated servers and on dedicated segments of networks. There are ways that we could do that for critical services in this country and even change the way we approach things like networking and shared data. I mean, there are ways to do it. It's not just the way that it's been done. Remember, they've been built to scale to a certain degree globally and to also create vendor lock-in. Those are the two things that have really been built. AWS, Azure, GCP, those folks, it's the new operating system wars. It really, really is that I want that developer mindshare. So I think the big thing is going to be okay, is your data protected and secure, or is your user's data protected secure for your particular application, not something we can really mandate from the top down because it just won't work.
One thing I want to sort of point out is then you have to look at the stack, right? There's one thing to talk about the server. Okay, the server's in Toronto. If worse comes to worse, we can lock it up. We can cut the internet connection so that the Americans can't take what's on that server, right? But there's also that whole tech stack that is decades of development and research. Let's look at something like LLMs. How many AI companies today are building on top of an LLM? We don't know how many, probably 80% of them. None of those LLMs are Canadian, I can guarantee you that. Okay, they mostly probably American. China has its own LLM. We don't have our own. So what if President Trump decides, you know what, those LLMs, that's just way too precious for us to share them with Canada. I'm yanking it. What happens to our AI industry? Boom, dominoes. Search, we don't have our own search. I use Elasticsearch. There's different search parameters there, but none of them are Canadian. And, you know, Marc and Etienne talked about, well, we can do open source, sure, but there's a huge expertise. Having the code is one thing, but you need the services, the people, like Elasticsearch is highly complex. IBM runs Elasticsearch, Oracle runs Elasticsearch. I don't know that there are any Canadians that do. We actually looked for Canadian providers, didn't find any. And you can't just sort of, you know how hard it is just to find AI talent to work in your company, never mind finding Canadian companies that are doing all this level in the stack. So, you know, again, Marc said 22 billion is too much to invest. And then he also said just AWS alone is the entire investment of Canada. Well, that's just one provider. I mean, there's all the LLMs. How much money do you think went into that? All of search, how much money went into that? And we don't own any of it. So this is not something you're solving in 30 days, even after you get over the hosting.
You know what's sad? You talk about there was mention of like Geoffrey Hinton before. Geoffrey Hinton, U of T. The other co-winner, Joshua Bengio, University of Montreal. And Jan LeCun. None of them are American, and they've all made American companies very rich.
Yeah, we were the best at one point. We have the best academics. We're not great at the economics of it. And we've got to get a lot better at market innovation. We've got the technology innovation. What we don't have is marketing chutzpah, and we need to get that. Sales, we need to get chutzpah. That's what we need.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have. So thanks the panel for a lively session.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. So just to remind you, basically we have already done some roundtable discussions on the topic of AI, and this event today is helping to fill the gap so that we can put forward a very robust paper for our consultation. Today's event has been recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. think I've covered everything. Thank you all for coming. We do have a networking reception at the back of the room. And on behalf of the Canadian Internet Society, I want to thank you for joining us today.